Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the overview of a functional behavioral assessment. And this particular content area in this podcast represents a transition into the meat and potatoes of our coursework and what we're really going to focus on developing our skills. So when we talk about a functional behavioral assessment in an overview, we're going to really talk about what is it? What constitutes a functional behavioral assessment? What are we going to need to do to develop one and to have a sound, best practices, ethical, legally defensible functional behavioral assessment? And some of those things are, we're going to have an operationally defined behavior. And that's very easily said, but really difficult to do sometimes for some people. It seems to be first nature for everybody or second nature for everybody to use what we call descriptive labels. So for example, oftentimes you'll see used and discussed, and it just is part of our everyday discussion, is we use the term aggressive. Aggressive means a lot to you or I. We kind of have an idea, although, however, if you really look into it, we probably have our own individual definitions of what's aggressive. What's aggressive for me may be different from what's aggressive for you. Because of that difference in our perceptions and our use of language, we do what's called operational definitions. And what those are very specific descriptions of the behavior at hand. So, for example, aggression could be operationally defined as student hits other students with hands and feet during class time. Additionally, it could be something like disrupts class. The descriptive label being disrupts class. Our particular operational definition of that would be student talks out, gets out of seat frequently, and disrupts class that way. So I hope you can see the subtle distinction there between the descriptive labels of aggression or disruptive and the operational definitions of those two things, hitting with hands and feet and or talking out of turn and standing up in class. Now that's important that we have operational definitions. One, because it's legally required. Two, because in best practices, we need to have that to be able to assess whether we're making a difference with the behavior, and for the people that we're going to consult with, our consultees, to be aware of the specific behavior that we're trying to change. So operational definitions are very important. Additionally, we need to look at the antecedents. Now, antecedents are oftentimes undervalued or minimized and or sometimes not even fully captured. And when we say antecedents, the sort of definition for antecedent is all the things that occur before the behavior. And when we talk about all the things, that includes environmental issues, what the classroom is like, time of day. There could be distant antecedents, like did the student have issues at home before they came to school? Did they eat breakfast? Was there a history with another particular student? What students were involved? What was the classroom activity at a given time? What curricular work was going on? What instruction was given to the students? So it's a myriad of things that occur beforehand. And it's important that we look very carefully at those, because when we do, we can often find the triggers to our problem behavior. A lot of times when you consult, you'll hear teachers or other school professionals say, it happens all the time. What that essentially means is it's a high frequency behavior, but we know it doesn't happen all the time. There are times when it doesn't happen. And as behavior analysts, school psychologists, and behavior intervention case managers, we need to go and determine when those specific times are to kind of narrow out or ferret out those times when it does happen and when it does not. So antecedents are the second component of a functional behavioral assessment. The third component is behavioral function. And we'll talk more about this in future podcasts, as well as in our course readings and in our course discussions and activities. But function of behavior is critical to a functional behavioral assessment, as well as a functional analysis assessment. What function gets at, or what it means essentially, is what does that particular behavior, the problem behavior, aggression, or disrupting class, get for the student? What does the student get out of it? That's what we've got to really look into. That's not easy for us to do if we're not trained in it, to look at behavioral function. Some of the commonly discussed functions in the literature as well as in practice are attention, access, escape avoidance, or automatic. And let's go over a few of those just to kind of get us a general overview of these things. So attention as a behavioral function can mean that when a student performs an inappropriate behavior, whatever it be, aggression or acting out in class, disrupting class, what have you, they gain attention from peers, from staff, or from the teacher, or from anybody. So that attention can be negative and or positive. It can be laughing by students, which would probably be positive attention, or it could be negative attention, where the student is getting ridiculed by other students or by the teacher. Again, that's kind of counterintuitive, but it's important to kind of keep that conceptually in our mind. Escape and avoidance is another function. And what is meant by escape and avoidance is that a student may perform a particular behavior to escape or avoid engaging in a non-preferred or an unpreferred or an activity that they just don't enjoy. So if you could think about this in terms of the school context, you could think that maybe a student has great difficulty with math work, and they really, really detest doing math worksheets. So to stop doing them, or to escape it, or to avoid having to do them, the student has developed and learned, and maybe even been inadvertently reinforced by when they act out or they get out of seat and they start making funny noises and disrupting the class. So again, what that means is the student is performing the inappropriate behavior as a way of escaping or avoiding the undesired activity. So that's the second of our behavioral functions. We've talked about attention, we've talked about escape avoidance. Let's talk about sensory or automatic. And that's the most difficult for us as professionals, as school psychologists, as behavior analysts to really look at and to kind of understand. Because it's an internal situation. And what I mean by that essentially is when the student is performing the behavior, the consequence or the function that it serves, or what's going on, is internal within the students themselves. So in other words, a student does a particular behavior because they enjoy it, or a student engages in a particular behavior because it stops or brings an end to or reduces something that they don't like. So there's something internal going on with the student that we're really not that able to observe, and all we can do is infer it by ruling out the other functions and by making some observations of the student and their physical states as they're performing the behavior. So we've talked about attention, escape avoidance, and automatic or sensory. The last function that we need to talk about is called access. And that essentially is a situation where a student performs an inappropriate behavior as a means of, or as a method of, or as a way to get access to something. That access could be a preferred activity or a preferred area, or it could be access to some sort of tangible thing, whether it be a toy for younger students in kindergarten and elementary settings, or it could be access to a certain area of a high school classroom or something of that nature. So those are essentially the four most commonly discussed behavioral functions when we talk about function of behavior in the literature and in the practice of school psychology, as well as our practical and clinical interventions. So again, review, it's escape avoidance, attention, sensory or automatic, and access. So those are the four functions of behavior. So again, going back to the overview of the functional behavioral assessment, it involves determining antecedents. It involves determining behavioral function, hypothesizing about behavioral function. And lastly, it looks at the consequences, or the activities, or all the actions, activities, and contextual variables that occur after the problem behavior has been performed. After it's been performed, then we look at, how are the other students reacting to them? What does the student get out of this? Do they get to leave classroom? Do they get an office referral? Do they get sent outside of the course-room? Do they get sent over to another area of the classroom? Do they get to do this, that, or the other? So those are the things, the three most important components of a functional behavioral assessment. In our future podcasts and our course discussions and in future weeks, we'll look more in depth at all three of those specific areas and talk a little bit more about each area so that we have good competence and good skills in those areas.